We begin with Michael Grothe-Hammer from the Universität in Berlin with a paper on network ethnography, analyzing a multi-organizational emergency response network using mixed method approach. So, over to you, Michael.
Yeah, thanks a lot. First, I want to say that Jörg and I are very thankful for the possibility to present today. Jörg is unfortunately busy today, so it's my part to do that. Today I'm going to present our mixed methods approach and, of course, first findings of our analysis of an organizational emergency response network in Düsseldorf. So the object of our study is this multi-organizational emergency response network in Düsseldorf, which means fire and rescue service, police, and so on and so on. We will see that later. And the lead organization, there is some kind of lead organization for this network, is the fire and rescue service of the city of Düsseldorf. So that's not really surprising. Because the service is the responsible operator for every fire or rescue operation in this city. Nevertheless, the multi-organizational coordination is very important. So our purpose on this topic is not only to see how the several organizations are connected, that's the SNA part, but also we want to see the quality of the ties, the coordinative practices that, for example, reproduce these ties. What are they doing there? So what we are trying to combine social network analysis, as we know it, with organizational ethnography. And yeah, let's see how that works. Maybe we should call that network ethnography, but we are not sure about that. We can discuss that later. So at first I will, we will have a very short glimpse on trends and social network analysis. That's not the, everyone here will be aware of that. Then I will talk a little bit about organizational ethnography, what this means. Then I will introduce what we mean by network ethnography, and then I will present first results of our study. So, as we all know, there are several trends in social network analysis, dynamic SNA, post-structural SNA, very fancy stuff presented on the last Sunbelt conference. For our research, it is important that there are several social network analysis studies on emergency response networks. But these are focused on specific members of different organizations and how they are connected personally, or they are focused on very specific events. So, for example, there was a fire or something like that, and then there is an SNA for these hours. So. And in addition to that, we have, of course, qualitative SNA like Jörg did, and we have these mixed methods approaches that we try to pick up. So, some words about organizational ethnography. The origins are administrative practices, for example, in the British Empire to cope with the needs to manage outposts. That these studies are not very scientific, they're racist and so on, but in fact it was some kind of ethnography. So in the scientific in a scientific meaning, we have, of course, the Hawthorne studies. In addition to that, in-depth analysis of the informal organization. For example, Bensman and Gerber. I don't know if it is quite that famous here in Britain, like in Germany, where you have the use of a tap in airplane construction that was formerly illegal and so on. Very famous in Germany. These were ethnographic studies, but they were not much reflexive about how they gained the data. There was no stringent methodology or something like that. This changed with the methodological renewal by Van Manen in the late 70s, where we have the start of something, of some kind of methodology you can call organizational ethnography. So in short, it's not a positivistic approach, it's more a naturalistic approach. As I already said, there is the development from these old studies of human relations to some kind of ethnography, and at present we have several streams. We have a wide range of several topics and so on. We had a special issue in the Journal of Management Studies. We had the founding of the Journal of Organizational Ethnography in 2012 and so on. So there is some kind of very fancy development. So, and what does organizational ethnography mean? What is it? It's not just one more tool in the box. So it's not the screwdriver. It's a methodology. It's a whole approach to deal with the field. And organizational ethnography means doing ethnography in and of organizations. It is primarily based on observational data. That is the important core. But, and that are the differences to usual ethnography. There are often short or medium-term studies. So you usually don't have these classic ethnography with 2 or 3 years in the field. You're usually returning home for the night because there's finishing time. Yeah, and you're commonly entering the field for several short periods. Then it is supplemented with interviews and audiovisual recordings. And this is a difference to other studies. You have the importance of analysis of documents because these are typically produced by organizations. And one option is the choice of a theoretical approach. So, maybe you can discuss that, but it's an option. And typical for organizations as well is that you have to decide if you want to research up or research down the hierarchies. And that is important for us here. In large organizations it is impossible to get a whole picture. I think it's clear you have thousands of members, so you can't just go there and see everything. So, what do we mean by the term network ethnography, by combining it? We do not mean netnography, that is internet ethnography. So, to make that clear. And, we mean the ethnography of networks, of all organizations, and to do so, we have to observe multiple sides of the network. So we have to, we think we have to focus and use something that is called focused ethnography, because we can't just go there for 2 or 3 years, stay there and so on, because we have large organizations, we have a large network, so we have to focus on several sites. So that is why we use this technique, and we are doing ethnography for subsystems of the network. For example, topics, groups, and so on. And we think that this is a mixed method approach rather than pure ethnography, because we are mixing, and we will see that later, we are mixing qualitative and quantitative methods of data collection and analysis. So we are using at the moment we are using a convergent parallel design, which means that we have a quantitative data collection analysis on the one hand, we have a qualitative data collection and analysis on the other hand, and then we compare or relate these findings, and then we have an interpretation. So this for the introduction, so let's see the fancy stuff. At first, I want to show you our first SNA findings. This is the formal emergency response network since 2010. It is a formal network of all possible ties of anticipated fire and rescue operations in the so-called alarm and march out order. This alarm and march out order contains alert headings, so that means what case of emergency we have, alert stages or phases, and the correlated responses. And in this document it is also regulated which other organizations have to be or should be alerted in a case of a specific event. So what is happening? You have the control center. You have an emergency call. Oh, I have a fire in the cellar room. Then the operator looks. Then the operator picks out the right alert heading in this alarm and march out order and chooses the right response, and then there is regulated which organizations have to be called. So this is a formal network. It is. We have to be careful in analyzing this result, but in fact, yeah, it's a formal network of possible ties. So, you cannot be sure if all these cases are really happening, but in fact, the ties are real because they are regulated, they are planned. The organizations know, oh, in this case, we have to work together with these organizations and so on. So, these ties are real in this sense, but we have to be careful. What can we see from this first result? We see a highly differentiated planned network, many established connections, and a central position of fire and rescue service and police, which is not very surprising because, it's the control center of the fire and rescue service, but in fact, every fire and rescue operation is operated from the fire and rescue service, so the central position of the fire and rescue service is for real. Then we have a comparison to a formal emergency response network of 1999, and yeah, of course I don't have to say very much, but you see the development. There are much more connections, much more organizations, so we have a clear development over 10, 11, 12 years in coordination between those organizations. This is the SNA. What we can now see is the whole network. Yeah, 5 minutes. Okay. What we cannot see is the whole network of non-formalized ties, the details of the clusters. So we have clusters here, 8 organizations and hospitals. And the quality of connections, the multidimensionality, the coordinating practices, and so on. So what we have to do is further quantitative SNA using multiple types of documents, and to figure out quality practices and reasons for developments, we will use our ethnography, observations, interviews, videos, photos, analysis of documents, which means we will have to mix methods. So, network ethnography in action. We already had a few stays in the field. For example, there was in rescue service for 2 weeks. I sat in the back of that ambulance and were on rescue operations with the paramedics. And yeah, I want to present 1 or 2 examples of our findings that to illustrate what we see by using ethnography in combination with SNA. The first example is everyday life medical emergency operations. So, one moment. So, and this is one brief example for the collaboration between paramedics and hospitals. And after hospitalizing a patient, paramedics need a signature of a doctor and a stamp of the hospital. They need the signature and stamp for a transportation certificate so that the health insurance pay the fire and rescue service for the transport. And first finding is that many doctors sign this certificate blind, even when they have no functional responsibility for the patient. So the paramedics go in, I need a signature, oh okay, here, that's what's happening there. That's the first thing. The other thing is the paramedics stamp the certificate by themselves. They get the stamp out of the drawer and use it. Sometimes they are alone in the medical staff room. They just go there, okay, it's here. Well, these practices, yeah, they practice that not only in hospitals they know, but in every hospital in town. And these practices are not based on personal acquaintance, and is not limited to a few hospitals or paramedics. It is a network-wide cultural practice. So, for example, one day we came to a hospital that the paramedics didn't know in Düsseldorf, but they just asked, well, so where's your stamp? And they said, oh yeah, it's there, go ahead, no problem. So that's, I think that's a very interesting finding that illustrates that illustrates what meaning is behind this type, and that's just one dimension. We have several other dimensions, and I have no time to present them here, but there are several levels of cooperation, and we can see them by using ethnography and interviews to illustrate this one central tie here. So, 1 minute? Okay, then I guess I will skip the second example. That was, of course, my plan. So we have, of course, open questions because we are at the very beginning of our project. So we modified organizational ethnography, combined it with SNA towards a network approach, and we're struggling with several problems with legal and ethical limitations. So we have problems to take pictures or make videos of patients and so on. We have, for example, we are not sure about how to intensify our observations because we have to intensify. We did it. For example, I stayed 2 weeks in the rescue service and I made 7 24-hour shifts, what is twice as much as they normally do to intensify our observation. Or we were on Carnival and we used 2 researchers to have some kind of researcher triangulation in this kind. So if there are any questions, I would be happy, and if there are any ideas for us to improve our project, that would be fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Michael, and for giving a very interesting example of social networks embeddedness, if I may. Okay, we've got a question there already.
Okay, I'm Louise Ryan, Middlesex University. Thank you very much, Michael. That was fascinating. Any network map that has beekeepers and chimney sweeps in it, I think, is always entertaining. But it's very interesting what you're talking about, combining these different methods of data collection. And as you say, there's the kind of formal account of there is a connection between this hospital and this paramedic. But as you said, when you go and observe it, it might be of, paramedic not having any direct personal connection with somebody, but just stamping. And it sort of challenges a lot of my stereotypes about German efficiency, that they're just leaning over the counter and, oh yeah, I'll stamp it myself. It's quite a shock for me to hear that. But I think it sort of raises a bigger question about what we mean by the connections, because presumably, I wonder if you could bring up the more detailed map, the more recent one. Thank you. Because presumably there are sort of formal, almost binding legal agreements between these organisations, so between the fire service and the ambulance service or something. So on some level, there is a written protocol, there is a written agreement, so that connection exists, and you are accurately stating that if you look at the documentation, there is a connection there. What you're then doing perhaps is adding another layer on top of this, I might dare to suggest, which is more about the interpersonal connections and interfaces, which is what you're observing. Because although that paramedic is just leaning over the counter and stamping the piece of paper, nonetheless there is also a written protocol, I imagine, or some kind of agreement which is in place. So in a sense, through the more formal data collection, you are collecting something that is accurate and exists. And then through your ethnography, you're not collecting the same data, you're collecting different data, which perhaps speaks to a different way of looking at the relationship. And they're both true, they're both accurate, but they're not the same thing, and one is not invalidating the other. They're just showing it through a different lens. So I wonder if what you're doing could be seen as a different map, which is more about the day-to-day personal interconnection. So maybe that's what you were already doing, but for me it just seems like that you're collecting different data through the two techniques.
Okay, thank you. I know there is something else. I'm tempted to... No, but I'm not trying.
No, don't throw it.
Following on your point and the two different sets of data, and I think is the connection, obviously the connection between the two, and you can get dismayed at German that its lack of efficiency. But I would argue that it's kind of symbolic of trust, and that they trust each other, and you have that maybe legal framework so they can do that. So that facilitates that sort of kind of behaviour. So in some ways I'd be interested to see how the kind of established network implies trust through the network in relationships between people on the ground.
So not a question as such.
Well, do you want to react to the comments maybe in some way, or suggestions?
Yes, of course. Thank you at first for the comments. Yes, we are aware of that. And we are aware that there are many, that there are much more connections that we don't see here. For example, we know that there's a connection between Düsseldorf Fire and Rescue Service and the bus companies, because they are preparing for potential disasters and so on. So yeah, I would agree with you. I guess but for me it's one way to enrich these two views to each other. Forgot the point.
Trust.
Trust. Yeah, maybe we have to work on that. I have to be honest. We are at the very beginning. We have a couple of weeks of ethnographic research. We have many interviews that are not that are not analyzed yet, and yes, I guess it's trust.
Is there any other very quick question or comment for Michael? Okay, I just have one. Very quickly, I'm just wondering the extent to which you're doing this to address purely sociological questions and issues, or what are also the policy implications of this in terms of efficiency on the field and so on. So I don't know whether it's within the scope of your research or not.
Yeah, I cannot speak for my colleagues, but yeah, I'm a sociologist, and yeah, actually we have none of these policy questions, because that's really difficult, and the Düsseldorf Fire and Rescue Service is part of the city administration. The police is part of the state administration, and we have, so yeah, that's a very it's a very difficult topic. So yeah, our purpose now is to understand the network and the network practices in emergency response cases, or for example high reliability cases, but no, actually we are not in policy.
Okay. Thank you so
But
much.
it would be a very interesting point there. You can trust me.
Thanks for that. I think that Michael, yeah, we can move to the last presentation for today, which is from Gemma from Manchester University, and it's about using mixed method social network analysis to investigate the meaning structure of personal social networks.
Alright, thank you. Luckily I've been teaching my lectures at 4 o'clock in the afternoon this semester, so I'm used to doing the graveyard shift, sending everyone off to sleep before they go home, but I'll try and avoid that. So in this paper I want to make 3 main points. The first is I want to talk a bit about the value of the concept of the meaning structure of social networks, which comes from the work of Jan Fuchs. And I want to suggest that this concept of the meaning structure of social networks helps us to better specify and unpack what we mean by the culture of social networks. The second point I want to make is that this level of the meaning structure of social networks can be unpacked using qualitative data. And the data that I'll use in this paper is from historical archives relating to the suffragette movement. And the third point is that I think that when we do draw attention to the meaning structure of social networks, we can actually better understand how networks actually work through the interplay of structure and culture, and also how actors within networks actively engage with and employ strategies to kind of work with their network, if you like. So those are the points I'm hoping to illustrate. Yeah, so the case I'm going to use to illustrate them is the case of the British suffrage movement. Nick and I did a wider project from this, drawing some EgoNet data in particular out of that project. It's especially for Louise, who can go back to her suffragette research history. Okay, so there's a lot of talk obviously about how we connect up structure and culture within social network analysis. And I think a lot of the kind of discussion around culture and networks talks about the ways in which qualitative data can be used to access and explore the subjective perceptions of actors. And I think we've had a good sense of that in a lot of the presentations today, which use interview narratives in order to see how actors actually define with other actors and the kind of meanings that they attach to those relationships. And in that sense, qualitative data has been seen as sort of essential for getting at the insides of the network, where formal social network analysis might help us to see its kind of outsides, it's the kind of structural configuration of the relationships. What I want to talk about today is actually using qualitative data to look at a slightly different level, to think of culture not so much as individual subjective perceptions, but as that intersubjective level of the network. So that level of shared meanings, of which individual network actors all have to draw. So in that sense, this kind of intersubjective cultural level is as constraining as it is enabling of action within networks. And some social science, sociological literature, especially within social movement studies, where I kind of also have a home, is to sometimes see culture as just all about agency, as always enabling, and not also as kind of constraining. And also, as Francesco Paletta puts it, culture is not just in people's heads, it's this shared intersubjective level of which people have to draw. So that's really the level that I want to try and unpack today through this concept of the meaning structure. So, for example, we've got lots of clues that the kind of essential structural building blocks of networks are actually rooted in shared meanings. So when in formal SNA we talk of things like tie types, for example, so we model relationships based upon kinship or friendship or being colleagues and so on. Those tie types are really cultural categories, cultural models that we employ, which set expectations about how we relate to others. So friendship, for example, has a different set of expectations and obligations around it compared to kinship and colleagues and so on. So actually even some of the structural building blocks of networks like tie type are rooted in these shared intersubjective meanings. And I really like this concept of the meaning structure of the network suggested by Fuchs for helping point to this intersubjective level. And Fuchs says that the meaning structure of the network can be thought about as having kind of three elements to it. The first is network culture, by which he points to things like shared discourses, kind of shared cultural scripts from which actors within the network have to draw, shared symbols and schemas and so on. Then there are interpersonal expectations attached to identities, and interpersonal expectations attached to relationships. So Fuchs says the meaning structure of the network can be thought of in these three terms, these three elements. So in this paper I kind of apply this concept of a meaning structure to help us understand the process of becoming a militant suffragette. So the research that I've been doing has been about the Women's Social and Political Union, which was the kind of more militant branch of the suffrage movement, established by Emmeline Pankhurst in Manchester in 1903. And in 1905, Christabel Pankhurst in Manchester committed the first militant act to the suffrage movement. And in the early days, militancy in the suffragette movement essentially meant the kind of tactic of intentional arrest and imprisonment. So suffragettes would go about perhaps doing things that we wouldn't consider that controversial today, like marching to Parliament with a petition, but they knew in the process of that they were going to be arrested and imprisoned, and then when they came out they would be martyrs for the cause and go on speaking tours and so on. And over time, militant tactics kind of evolved to include more violence, stone throwing and window smashing, arson, destruction of letterboxes and sports pavilions and works of art and so on. So what I was interested in within this project is why was it that some members of the WSPU decided to adopt these militant tactics and some other members decided not to. And there's lots of different ways, of course, we could try and answer that question. Historians look at the importance of activist biographies, prior political engagements, and particular dyadic relationships of significance. But I'm going to argue that if we want to explain why local women decided whether or not to adopt these militant tactics, then we need to explore the meaning structures of their personal social networks. So methodologically, what I did is I compared two suffragettes who made different decisions. One suffragette who did adopt militant tactics, Helen Watts, over on the right. Helen Watts was single, middle-class daughter of a local vicar in Nottingham, and she twice adopted militancy in 1909 when she went to prison for the WSPU, and on the second time she went on hunger strike. And the other suffragette didn't adopt militancy but was still heavily involved with the WSPU, and that's Mary Blathwaite. She was a member of the Bristol and Bath branch of the WSPU. And again, she had kind of some similar characteristics. Both these women were 27 when they first became involved with the suffragettes. Both were single, both were from well-off families who were fairly prominent within their local areas. And both of them had no prior political involvements whatsoever before the suffrage movement. So I was really interested to find out why one of them did decide to adopt militant tactics and the other one didn't. And in order to do that, I reconstructed their personal activist networks from across the period of their involvement. So the data are longitudinal, they span at least 6 years of involvement in the case of each suffragette. And the historical archives that I used to reconstruct their personal networks come from Mary Blathwaite from a collection of diaries written by her mother and her father, who were also involved in the movement, from 1906 to 1914. And for Helen Watts, I used an archive of 23 letters and 11 speeches that she gave when she was released from prison on her kind of suffragette martyrdom tour. And using these sources and cross-referencing them with other historical data and reference guides, I was able to construct an idea of their personal activist networks, as I call them, and how they changed over time. So you've got in the slides, you'll see that there's a series now of networks, so you can see where I've reconstructed them. So I took the relational data from those historical archives and got a sense of who were the important ties, who they related to, who were relevant for their activism over those years. Now in doing this, in mapping the ties using UCINet and measuring some of the structural properties, so doing the kind of more formal SNA, there were some interesting clues as to how they came to have opportunities to adopt these militant tactics. Because the thing should be said is at the beginning of the campaign, at least, you couldn't just go, hey, I'm going to go out there and get arrested. You actually had to be invited by Mrs. Pankhurst herself, who'd write you a letter saying, would you like to join the deputation, on which you knew you were going to be arrested. So both of these women came across these opportunities, concrete opportunities for adopting militancy through the kind of existence of these sort of weak ties or bridges to the national movement within their networks. So this is Helen Watts' network in Nottingham, and nearly everyone she knows are also members of the Nottingham branch of the WSPU. But the triangle here, Nell Kenny, actually works for the national WSPU and was one of the travelling organisers. And there's quite a lot in the network's literature on how new practices diffuse about the importance of these weak ties, these travelling organisers who take practices from one group and introduce them to another. Similarly, after Helen Watts has been in prison, this is what her network looked like before she adopted militancy again later in 1909. And she's got not only Nell Kenny now, but Nellie Crocker, some more triangles here who are her connections to the national movement. And this is Mary Blathwaite's EgoNet, and importantly here, Annie Kenny was her contact in the national WSPU. And through Annie Kenny, she became known to the Pankhurst, and Mary Blathwaite received her invitation to adopt militancy in June 1909, which she actually rejected. The other thing that we might say from looking at the kind of structural features of their networks is that they've all also kind of got direct contacts with other militants, people who've already adopted militancy, who can become important examples, important routes of socialisation for them. So within Mary Blathwaite's personal network, the black triangles are people who've already gone to prison by the time she gets her opportunity to adopt. So I think by doing the formal SNA, it is instructive in showing how things like weak ties and the composition of the network lead to opportunities to adopt militancy. However, what I think is that looking at these structural properties can only go so far in actually explaining why one woman adopted and the other didn't. And the reason that is because these structural features are actually mediated by the meaning structure of the network. So structural features are all very well to kind of map and measure them, but actually when do they have effects and what those effects are is always conditioned by the kind of cultural aspects of the network. So I just want to give 3 examples, one from each element of the meaning structure, to show what I mean there. So the first example is to do with network culture. So what Fuchs refers to as those shared cultural discourses, those shared cultural scripts in operation within a network. And actually, this can be quite instructive to us in thinking about why it was that Watts adopted militancy and Blathwaite didn't. When we look at the actual kind of cultural contents of the discussions and debates that were going on in their network at the time. So within Watts' network, for example, we see that a kind of consensus around the moral legitimacy of using militant tactics is quite easily achieved. And part of that is because her network is very homogenous in terms of the people within it. There's not a lot of dissension and debate or questioning over the kind of moral legitimacy of militant tactics. So in that sense, there's this kind of shared discourse within that network that you could all draw upon, that militant tactics are actually rightful and justified. And Watts talks about how, you know, we all saw within the Nottingham Union that it was our moral duty to protest. When we look at Mary Blathwaite's network, and we kind of use the historical archives to actually look at the cultural content of the network, the discourses going on at the time, there was actually a lot more discussion, dissension and debate over the kind of legitimacy of using militant tactics. So, for example, some nice quotes from the diaries. In 1909, when there were examples of militancy, for example, 3 young suffragettes who were named young hot bloods went and hit Asquith round the head with a whip and said, you know, take that for the women of England. And these suffragettes were actually personally known to the Blathwaite family, who were all involved in the movement. And it really kind of confronted them with this question of whether these tactics were actually morally right or not. And in the diaries, Mrs. Blathwaite writes, "It's a terrible time. We do not know if these people are right or wrong." And there's a letter exchange recorded in the diaries about these 2 hooligans we know who made a regular raid on Mr. Asquith, breaking a window and using personal violence. And one of the suffragettes involved writes to them and says to the father of the family that she hopes that he is not shocked at their punching Asquith in the head. I am writing back coldly saying how grieved we are. Then Vera returns the letter expressing she is very sorry we are grieved, but if Mr. Asquith will not receive deputation, they will pummel him again. So within Mary Blathwaite's network, even though it looks from the composition that she actually has got a lot more contact with a lot more militants, lots more black triangles in this network than Helen Watts, actually what that meant was there was more confrontation with militancy as a tactic, more questioning about the kind of justifications and legitimacy for it. It was much harder for there to be consensus within that network, a kind of discourse of legitimacy which you could easily draw upon. So that's my example of how I think looking at that level of the shared cultural discourses is instructive as to why one takes their opportunity and the other one doesn't. The other examples are from the interpersonal expectations in play in the networks relating to identities and to relationships. So expectations relating to identities, while we would expect that middle-class women at this time, there'd be a lot of pressure exerted on them not to adopt these types of tactics. The media was very critical of women who did, and particularly women of standing within their community, like both these suffragettes were. So strong ties in particular, the social movements literature shows, have a kind of controlling effect over people's involvement in what we might call high-risk activism. But what's interesting about Helen Watts' network is that she's able to actually subvert the effect, the controlling effect of strong ties by keeping her activism secret. And of course, this interplays with network structure. For Watts, when she first has an opportunity to adopt, none of her family are involved in her activism, and she keeps it a secret from anyone that she actually intends to engage in militancy. So she's able to actually adopt a strategy of secrecy, which subverts this kind of controlling influence of strong ties. Whereas Mary Blathwaite, and this is where we can really see the cultural aspect interplaying with network structure, is unable to adopt this strategy of secrecy. Her parents are the most central people in her network alongside her. They have maximum degree centrality. They have the highest betweener centrality in her network. They mediated all of her contacts with other suffragettes. And when she gets her letter from Mrs. Pankhurst, she writes back, she records in the diary, I told her that I could not go on the deputation because father would not like it. And later on we have examples in the diaries of when there's violence happening in Bristol, actually Annie Kenny has been told by the parents to get Mary out of the way when there's any violence there so that she's not involved. So the controlling effect of those interpersonal expectations regarding identities had a chance to play out within Blathwaite's networks, but Watts managed to subvert them through employing secrecy. And the final example relates to interpersonal expectations regarding relationships. And I think what's interesting here are the expectations of the relationships between the actors and the other militants in their network. And it's very clear from the historical data that Watts continues at every point in her involvement to see other militants in her network as comrades, as people who are in it together, people who have duties and obligations to support one another in the activism. Whereas Mary Blathwaite, interestingly, the diary data reveals how she actually comes to redefine her relationship with other militants over time. So, by the end of her involvement, we can see that actually Mary Blathwaite is embedded within a very militant network. Over half her contacts by the end of her involvement are people who have been to prison. Yet, ironically, she is more dissociated from militancy than ever by the end of her involvement and resigns membership in 1913. So she actually doesn't break off her ties with activists because of this, because she's ideologically dissociated with militancy. Instead, she redefines what those relationships mean to her. And I suggest that she swaps a kind of relationship model or cultural category of comradeship for one of friendship, which has a different set of obligations and expectations around it. And what she does, rather than going on activist outings with them, they send them birthday cards, they have them to stay, they send them dates and oranges when they're in prison for having thrown stones. Mrs. Pankhurst, they refuse to put her up because they disagree with militancy, but instead they pay her hotel bills and her taxi bills. So actually, the network kind of looks the same. It looks like from the diagram that she's still heavily embedded in militancy. But what we can see from qualitative data is that she's redefined how she actually relates to those people. And by invoking a different cultural model, she brings into play a different set of expectations and obligations around those relationships. Okay, so brilliant. So to summarise then, I think that by focusing upon this level of the meaning structure of the network, we can start to unpack culture on a more intersubjective level. So looking at those shared cultural discourses and scripts and interpersonal expectations relating to identities and relationships. And I think this really does help us to understand, in the case of these two suffragettes, why one was actually able to take up opportunities that on the kind of level of the structure they both had. And I think it's actually quite a powerful argument to both sides about why it's important to look at the interplay between culture and structure. So the structural features of the network are helpful, looking at patches of density, looking at weak ties, looking at the composition of the network. But nevertheless, we don't know whether these structural properties have effects and what those effects are, unless we look also to the cultural factors that I've talked about here in terms of the meaning structure of the network. We could look at meaning structures purely qualitatively. My colleague at Manchester, Sue Heath, did this in her research on young people and making their decisions over higher education. And she interviewed ego and then she interviewed alters as well, in order to probe the shared discourses within that family unit or friendship unit around going to university. But I think that what I've hopefully shown here is it is useful to also map and visualise these networks using formal SNA to help us to look at the interplay between structure and culture. So I think that makes sense out.
Thank you very much. And any question, comment, reaction? Oh, not there. Okay. Anybody on my way? want to donate £1 to buy another microphone to Middlesex, please.
Thanks a lot for that. It was really impressive. Really enjoyed the presentation. Just to be devil's advocate a little bit, are we at risk of kind of erasing the individual from this? And maybe there's other biographical, personal details about them that don't show up in it. So I'm thinking, speculating maybe that Miss Watts, as somebody whose family wasn't involved in this movement, the fact that she joined as an individual makes her more inclined to be kind of especially invested and radical, whereas maybe it's more of a default for Mary Blathwayt. Perhaps is there room for that kind of analysis as well?
Sorry, a few more seconds to think. I don't think it erases the individual. At the end of the day, the archives on which all of both the networks constructed and analysed are all about that individual and their journey and their history of activism and so on. But I think it is important, I hope I brought out in the paper as well, that what's important to look at when thinking about meaning structures or structural properties is also how actors within the network actively work with it. So they can employ different strategies, even though those strategies might be shaped by the structure of the network. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of agency in there. So you talk about, well, maybe it's Watts didn't have the family from the beginning. So in a sense, she was enabled to employ a strategy, an active strategy of secrecy to keep the family out. And the family did come into it between her first and second involvements and did try to exert through the letter writing a bit of interpersonal pressure on her. Whereas Blathwayt, I guess, we don't know whether she would have wanted to employ a strategy of secrecy or not. All we can say is that she wasn't able to employ that strategy because of some of the configuration of her network and the kind of centrality that her parents have within it. So I think one thing I try to do in this paper is to show how these meaning structures are just not static and deterministic over action, but they're actively worked with by actors themselves who try to employ strategies, even though those strategies may come into limitations because of the structure of their network.
Yes. Thanks. Gemma, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your paper. I don't think there was any chance of anybody falling asleep at 4 o'clock listening to that, as I was really trying to follow everything. It was very engaging. And as you say, I started off doing, my PhD was on the suffrage movement, but in Ireland, so I was really interested in everything you had to say. But coming back to the question we've just had here, I think one of the very strong messages from your work is the danger of just reading meaning off of these kinds of images, that clearly there's so much more going on under the surface that you can't just impose a meaning on what these ties might be telling us. But I'm wondering as well about network boundaries, because what you've got here with these fascinating images are their activist networks. And I know, for example, from my research on the Irish suffrage movement, that many of them were involved in many different kinds of groups simultaneously. So in the Irish case, they may have been involved in anti-vivisection, or they may have been involved in campaigns around the nationalist movement, for example, or in some cases the unionist movement. So I'm wondering if maybe there's part of the jigsaw puzzle for these two women that might be missing here, which may be the other network ties they had, which may also be part of influencing their kind of personal decision-making, their personal stories. So maybe it's about how we also define the boundaries. And I, of course, accept that it can't be limitless. We've got to make this manageable for ourselves. So are you aware that these two women may have had other kinds of connections that may also be another side of the story?
Well, the short answer is no, they didn't have other types of connections. I think that obviously a lot of people involved in the suffragette movement did. A lot of the founders of WSP, like the Pankers, have been heavily involved in the Independent Labour Party in Manchester and so on. There was also the kind of anti-taxation league, and but these two suffragettes, they were very kind of like local figures of the movement, and in fact until my dad found a suitcase in the loft relating to Helen Watts. Suffrage history didn't even know that she'd really existed. So in some senses, these are kind of women who've not really been studied that much. And maybe they've got slightly different activist histories in that sense to other more sort of prominent campaigners. And the interesting thing I found about both of them is they weren't involved in any other types of political activity either before or after their involvement with the suffrage campaign, which was kind of fascinating really when you think about all the assumptions are often made in social movements as well about how people come to activism and what they go on to do after it. But I think that the question of network boundaries is a really key question and one to think a lot more about. I mean, one thing I kind of keep referred to these networks in different ways as personal activist networks. A couple of times I slipped in ego nets, and really, I've talked to Alessio about this, is that these two networks overlap in no ways. So Watts actually goes to visit Blathwayt twice in 1911, and they've got a lot of members in common from the suffrage campaign. And in that respect, they're beyond a kind of conventional ego net, and they probably are kind of snapshots of the wider suffrage movement. And in that sense, it's difficult to talk about discretely bounded network culture, a kind of discrete sense of what network culture is and where the boundaries of it are. And presumably there's a certain amount of shared discourses and scripts between these women because they're part of the same movement. So I think that the question of boundaries is a really key one to attest to.
Any other question? No? Okay, well, so thank you very much again, Gemma, for the